Eddie Alvarez is down for a fight. If you watched him fight Justin Gaethje, you will see that Eddie Alvarez is always go out there to go down there and throw it all on the line. And that's what he's going to do here against Dustin Poirier, I believe. You can never count Eddie out. You better, until the clock says 0-0-0 in the third round and you hear that horn, don't take a step in the wrong direction. Don't look the other way, because Eddie Alvarez will and can take you out. Yeah, that's about it. Bottom line, plain and simple. But Dustin Poirier is no joke also. He's 15-4-1 no contest since joining the UFC. Poirier is on a 2-fight win streak. Should be a very exciting main event between these guys. They definitely don't ever take their foot off the pedal. They both push the pace. And obviously now, because we know Conor's situation, there was a situation where these two possibly could have jumped ahead of the line, but I don't think that's going to happen now. I really think Conor will be the next person to fight Khabib. But the winner of this fight could very well be the guy waiting behind to see who wins that fight, if Tony Ferguson is not back and ready to go by then. Definitely you can see Eddie Alvarez or Dustin Poirier jumping ahead of line before Ferguson and getting that fight of the winner versus Conor versus Khabib. So there's a lot to look forward to at this main event. Should be a good one this Saturday. And that is it for UFC on Fox, Calgary. Now we are going to look into UFC 227, Dillashaw versus Cody Garbrandt 2. That is on August 4th. It is live on pay-per-view. The Fight Pass prelim main event is 20-4 Alex Perez versus 8-0 Jose Shorty Torres. Perez is on a 2-fight win streak in the UFC. Perez won a UFC contract week 5, season 1 of Dana White's Tuesday Night Contender Series. He likes to look for submissions from the front headlock position. That's how he won his fight that earned him the contract on Dana White's Tuesday Night Contender Series. That's also how he won his debuting fight. Jose Shorty Torres is 1-0 since joining the UFC. His first UFC victory came with a little controversy. He was pretty much dominated the entire fight by Jared Brooks. Jared Brooks picked him up to slam him on the ground and knocked himself out. When they were done scrambling, Jose Shorty Torres got over, started hitting Jared Brooks, and that is how Jose Shorty Torres won his very first fight. So pretty much outside of Jared Brooks knocking himself out, he would have lost that fight, but I guess it's MMA and anything can happen. You could even knock yourself out. Go imagine that one. Also on that card, 10-3-1 Betcha Crowe versus 8-4 Irene Aldana. Irene Aldana is the number 11 bantamweight contender. Betcha Crowe is the number 10 UFC bantamweight contender. Aldana is 2-1 since joining the UFC. She's a former Invicta FC fighter. She went 4-1 in the promotion. She's won her last fight against Talina Bernardo by unanimous decision. That was her first fight in the UFC. Betcha Crowe is 4-3-1 since joining the UFC. Only won one fight of her last 5. She has not won since 2016. She beat Jessica Eye at UFC 203. She got knocked out by Ronda Rousey in 34 seconds, and that says a lot because Ronda Rousey shouldn't be knocking anyone out. Obviously, if you watch the Holly Holmes fight, Ronda Rousey's hands were not all that. And for you to get knocked out by somebody whose biggest technique was a submission game, that's not boding well for you. You also got knocked out by Holly Holm. So it should be an interesting fight to see these two veterans of the game. Irene is a veteran, but she is a newcomer to the UFC, but she still has a lot of veteran experience coming with her to the UFC. 15-3 Pedro Munoz fights 15-1 Brett Johns. Munoz is the number 10 bantamweight contender, and Johns is the number 14 bantamweight contender. This is the Fox Sports 1 prelims main event. Johns is 3-1 since joining the UFC. His only loss is to Aljamain Sterling. Brett Johns has 5 submission wins. One in the UFC, he caught Joe Soto in a calf slicer. It was pretty dirty. Joe Soto went in for a takedown. Brett Johns just wrapped his left leg around Soto's left leg real quick, locked his legs in between each other, pulled his Joe Soto's at his legs back, got him in a nice little calf crusher. It was quick and easy. It was his second calf slicer in the UFC history. He finished Soto within 30 seconds. Pedro Munoz is 5-3 and 1 no contest in the UFC. Pedro Munoz has had trouble making weight before. He was 4 pounds over in his fight at UFC Fight Night 125 against John Dodson. Dodson declined to fight him that night, but they did go ahead and make that matchup happen for UFC 222, where Dodson was eventually victorious over Pedro Munoz. Pedro Munoz has had some trouble with USADA in the past. He has tested positive for elevated levels of testosterone in 2014. He was suspended 1 year for those actions. He's definitely turned everything around since then, minus the weight cutting issues, but that we can deal with. It's the elevated testosterone levels that we cannot. It should definitely be a fair playing game. If you can make the weight, that's fine. If you bulk back up after weigh-ins, I'll live with that. You know, you killed yourself to make that weight. But if you're going in there using steroids or elevated levels of testosterone or stuff like that, that's not really that fair. We should all have a fair human advantage, I guess you should say, not a chemically induced advantage. 25-9 Cub Swanson is fighting 12-1-1 Renato Moicano. Cub Swanson's the number 5 featherweight contender. Moicano is the number 10 featherweight contender. Swanson is 10-5 since joining the UFC. Cub has lost his last 2 fights. He lost to Frankie Edgar, and he was finished by Brian T. City Ortega. He's won Fight of the Night 5 times. Knockout of the night twice. Obviously, if you know Cub Swanson, he brings it. He's the type of guy that, like other guys that I've talked about today, have put the foot on the gas pedal and don't let go. Cub Swanson is always there to bring it. He is our modern day Diego Sanchez, if you may. Moicano is 4-1 since joining the UFC. That loss on his record came from Brian T. City Ortega, the number 1 featherweight contender in the world. The fight with Brian Ortega was Fight of the Night. Ortega ended up getting the submission deep into the 3rd round. I believe it was 3 minutes and 29 seconds into the 3rd round, if I'm right. And came out with the win. But Moicano held his own against Brian. He should definitely hold his own against Cub Swanson. It should be a really good fight. Moicano's a good fighter. He just took out Calvin Kattar, I believe, a couple of months ago. I'm not quite sure on that date. But that was a very good fight, too. I was actually pulling for Kattar on that one a little bit, but Moicano ended up coming out with that victory. Moicano is no slouch. He, obviously, like I said, he's only lost to T-City. We'll see. This guy could very easily be fighting T-City again, but with a belt on the line next time. 10-1 Poliana Vieira versus 6-2 JJ Aldridge. Poliana is 1-0 since joining the UFC. Vieira is a Jiu-Jitsu world champion. She won that Jiu-Jitsu Worlds in 2015. She's on a 6-fight win streak, all finishes. She's got 5 submissions and 1 knockout in that finish streak. JJ is 6-2 since joining the UFC. She's on a 2-fight win streak. She was on TUF 23. She was submitted by Tatiana Suarez in the 2nd round. That was in the 1st round of the TUF tournament. After TUF, she had to go and win 2 fights outside of the UFC before getting her call up. She made her debut to the promotion and hasn't looked back since. It should be a good fight. Poliana Vieira almost walked away from fighting before she made her UFC debut. Luckily, she didn't, and we will be seeing this fight in a couple of weeks at UFC 227. 17-6 Thiago Santos and 12-3 Kevin Holland have now been added to this UFC 227 because of the Alexander Gustafsson situation, which I'll get into in a second. Thiago Santos is the number 13 middleweight in the world. Thiago Santos is 9-5 since joining the UFC. He's won 4 of his last 5 fights. His last fight was to David Branch. He was on the Ultimate Fighter Brazil. He lost in the quarterfinals of that TUF tournament. Now, I know most of you are probably saying, who is this Kevin Holland character? Kevin Holland is making his UFC debut. He was actually on Season 2, Week 1 of Dana White's Contender Series. He won his fight by decision, but he did not win a contract that night. Obviously, as you've seen before, you don't technically have to win a contract that night to end up in the UFC. All you have to do pretty much is just show up and perform. And perform is what Kevin Holland did. He did a little showboating that fight, but it was definitely a good fight on Dana White Contender Series. This is a huge step up in competition for Thiago Santos. But Kevin Holland isn't a small guy. He's 6'3". He's got an 81-inch reach. Thiago Santos only has a 76-inch reach. It should be a good fight. This is Kevin Holland, that is the first fighter in Season 2 to debut in the UFC. I'm actually kind of excited to see what he can do in the UFC. Thiago Santos, like I said, is no slouch, and I think that is a pretty good opponent for him to take on. We definitely probably won't have a whole lot of showboating like we did last time. This is definitely a contender you do not want to showboat with, because he will take you out. Originally, we were supposed to have Alexander Gustafsson on this card. First bounce around the idea, the UFC that is, of him fighting Luke Rockhold or Yoel Romero. Obviously, that would contend on either one of those two moving up to light heavyweight. But the UFC and Alexander Gustafsson decided to move on with the number 2 lightweight contender, Volkan Ozdemir. Volkan Ozdemir was supposed to fight Shogun Rua. That was at UFC Hamburg. They pulled that fight against Shogun for Volkan Ozdemir to come fight Gustafsson. So Anthony Smith fought Shogun. Now, Ozdemir just recently broke his nose in training and had to pull out against Alexander Gustafsson. Now, Anthony Smith ended up beating Shogun Rua. Anthony Smith, after the fight, went ahead and called out Alexander Gustafsson to try to save that 227 fight for Gus, but Gus decided at the last minute, after he seen what Anthony Smith did, to say that he is going to deal with some minor injuries before he steps back into the octagon. So, a big tangled web of a mess that pretty much ended up not even happening. We have no Alexander Gustafsson on that card. Now we have no real light heavyweight contender fight on that card either. But hey, it is what it is. The co-main event for UFC 227 is 27-2-1 Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson versus 12-2 Henry Cejudo. Now, Henry is the number 1 flyweight contender. Obviously, Demetrius Johnson is the king of the flyweight division. He is the only UFC flyweight champion ever. He is currently riding a 13-fight win streak. Mighty Mouse has defended his UFC flyweight title 10 times. That is a UFC record. He broke Anderson Silva's record when he beat Ray Borg at UFC 216. 7 of DJ's 10 defenses were finishes, 5 by submission, 2 by KO. He has 5 total armbar finishes in his career, including his last fight against Ray Borg at UFC 216. He threw Borg in the air, caught him while he was in the air, threw him in an armbar. It's been dubbed now the flying armbar, the mighty armbar, all kinds of craziness. It was personally the best finish I've ever seen in my entire life. I was there with the wife. We seen it live in person. It was actually the cheapest seats we've ever bought, and it was the closest we've ever sit. Figure that one out. It was a great fight. Definitely one that I'll never forget. Henry Cejudo is no slouch, so he's 6-2 since joining the UFC. His only loss is to Joseph Benavidez and Demetrius Johnson. In the fight with Benavidez, Henry was deducted a point in the first round due to repeated low blows. In my opinion, if it was not for that point taken, he probably would have ended up winning that fight. Henry Cejudo is an Olympic gold medalist. He won the 2008 Olympic gold medal in freestyle wrestling at Beijing. He is on a 2-fight win streak. He's beaten Sergio Pettis and Wilson Reese. DJ and Henry fought for the first time at UFC 197. DJ won that fight with huge knees to the body. He hit Henry to the body like 7 or 8 times with knees. He finished that fight 2 minutes and 49 seconds into the first round. Usually, too, when DJ fights a guy for the second time, he usually is a lot better than he was the first time. Proved that against Benavidez. He proved that against Dotson. Henry, if he knocked you out once, he might do it again, and this time even more convincingly. And I don't know how he repeats that. Henry Cejudo is not the same fighter that he was when he fought DJ the first time, though. I will go ahead and say that.